Out of the Atlantic, one American's failed quest to protect civilians in Yemen. Last week, Saudi jets bombed a bus packed with schoolchildren in northern Yemen. The attack, which occurred during a field trip to mark the end of summer classes, killed at least 40 students aged 6 to 11 and left dozens more wounded, as footage from the scene later showed. After more than 3 years of war against the Houthi rebels and thousands of casualties, the attack was one of the conflict's most senseless and tragic. Over that time, the Saudi-led coalition, which consists primarily of Saudi and Emirati forces, has had the chance to adopt targeting practices that could help it avoid harming civilians. The bus strike and Riyadh's response do not suggest this is a high priority. Unbelievable. Children at the end of summer classes taking a field trip. Obliterated with American weapons. You should know. As I've talked about it before, I worked in Saudi Arabia briefly, and I was quite desperate for money at the time. That's what brought me there. And there was this idea that I could make a fortune there. And while it was true, it was so hard on my conscience. I eventually found a job working directly for King Saud University as faculty there. However, I had been offered much higher wages working for military and indirectly military-led coalition or led training. It was too hard on my conscience to go and work for a military company operating in Saudi, even though they offered me, it was something like a 6-figure salary for teaching English, which is completely unheard of anywhere in the world, but I could have done it out there in Saudi, but I chose a lesser paying job because I thought it would be easier on my conscience. Ends up not far from where I lived in Riyadh, a school of Americans were attacked by Al-Qaeda, I think it was, in 2012, and a bunch of them were killed, including an American. I did not tell my mom at the time, but it was risky, but you know, I'm tough, so I thought, okay, I can handle Saudi. But I remember when I got there, there was talk of the war in Yemen, and that had pretty much started and was in full swing, and I was just baffled by it. Just the strange connections and tie-ins. It was funny, like when I accepted the job, they bought me a flight to and from, or like a round trip, Minneapolis to Washington, D.C. I spent the day there doing visa stuff, going through all of the motions and getting completely certified. I went to the FBI building, all that stuff. And it was just so lavish. There was so much money. But then you go there, you go into the Middle East, and you just see just this darkness, just this kind of rejection of life, this rejection of music, this feeling that desire or any sensuality at all is bad. But I guess that's another discussion about Islam, which we can have. As a quick aside, it's been interesting engaging people about Islam, because having that Saudi experience is sort of my trump card, in the sense that someone was saying, oh, well, of course a Arab, why wouldn't an Arab salad have pork? When someone showed, oh, look at this Arab salad, it has pork in it. And this Moroccan guy is like, oh yeah, well, Muslims eat pork. And I'm like, well, okay, if you can find a pork refinery in Saudi, if you can find it in Arabia, which is the standard, I guess, that's the culture, the dominant culture. I mean, isn't Islam just replicating its culture worldwide? Oh boy, I have way too much to say, way too many directions to go with these topics. I just feel terrible about these children and just baffled that, you know, we're just standing here and letting this happen. And it's so, I guess the word for it is audacity, just all these things that have been going wrong with Saudi Arabia, and just how strange it was. Like there's at least some veil of resentment. You don't really know how people think in different parts of the world, including here in Vietnam. There's always that element of mystery, but like as far as the Saudis, they go right out and say it. I have this collection of quotes that I heard when I was out there, including things like music inflames the senses, you shouldn't listen to music, and jokes about jihad, jokes about, you know, looking at porn. Like, there's still the same, even though they have the deen, as they would call it, they don't really have the deen. They have the religion, but not the deen. And so I met this guy. He had business cards made for me, which had a spelling mistake. But at that point, I was like, oh, screw this, because I was determined to leave the Middle East anyway. But he used to make all these offers to me. He's like, oh, yeah, if you want girls, we can find you some girls. And I'm not even talking about prostitutes. All you had to do was go on Tinder or something, which, man, that's gross. Not for me. But and he would talk about getting me liquor, you know. Oh, you want some whiskey, you can get that. And that's been illegal in Saudi Arabia, or in Arabia. I shouldn't even call it Saudi Arabia. It's been illegal in Arabia for a century. And he offered to get me some pot. And I'm like, okay, I'll get some weed. I'm curious, like, what is the weed here? And so I called him a couple of times that week, and he said, no, I can't get it right now because of the war in Yemen. Because those bombs that were getting built with either taxes I was paying in America or taxes that I was paying in Saudi. Wherever I was working, of the two, my taxes went directly into these bombs that were destroying these school children that continues today. And nobody cares. And I am just mad as hell at Saudi Arabia right now, which brings me to the next story. Two stories. I wanted to address this. Saudi Arabia seeks the death penalty for female activist by David Kirkpatrick in the New York Times. Saudi Arabia, which is one of the highest execution rates in the world, is taking the rare step of seeking the death penalty for a 29-year-old female activist accused of encouraging demonstrations for greater rights for the Shiite Muslim minority, the advocacy group Human Rights Watch said. And so here we have a 29-year-old woman who, newsflash, she's a Muslim. She's part of the Shia, which is the more common in Iran, I guess. Iran would be the Shia. It's Sunni, and well, it's specifically like a Wahhabi Sunni in Saudi. And she's a Muslim arguing with other Muslims to give these certain Muslims more rights. And they're going to kill her. God. I never witnessed an execution in Riyadh, but I went to the very spot where the executions take place. And maybe I told this, I haven't seen my last video, I was talking about Saudi before. I've told the story in general many, many times because it's such a weird story. I went there on Friday, and Friday is Saturday to them, right? And I didn't quite make it in time. You had to go early in the morning, and I had heard a rumor that if, I guess, non-believer is there, they always push the non-believer because they want the eye contact with the person being executed, which they do by beheading in Dira Square in old downtown Riyadh with a scimitar. They just put the person on a block in front of a drain, and I didn't make it in time to see an actual execution. I'm not sure if I would have. Thinking back, going back, I probably would have. I mean, I'm curious, honestly curious, especially given the insane reasons that people are sentenced to death. But anyway, I went to the very spot, and you see children running around with footballs, and of course Arabs in traditional garb. That's the one thing about Saudi, especially in areas like that. They all wear this very traditional clothing. Not just the women with hijabs and whatnot, but the men as well are always wearing these long white robes and the Lawrence of Arabia hat, Where was I going with that? And as soon as I got there, it was during one of the calls to prayer, which, I always was exempt from. I didn't go in. But like 5 times a day, they would interrupt everything. And so they did a call to prayer, and the police, the religious police, were going through Dira Square and rounding everyone up and making them go into the mosque, except for me. And so I stood there, and I took a picture of the very drain where they chop off the person's head, and the blood goes down the drain, they wash it off. And this is the place where people just run around and play during the day. And I went there during, not an execution time, but during a play time. And given that in Mecca, you go around the Kaaba counterclockwise 7 times as part of the Hajj, which just ended. Eid Mubarak to any Muslim friends, not that I know that many, I guess. But I decided that going counterclockwise is like the clock going counterclockwise. It's like trying to keep things suspended back in time. And so I walked around the drain 7 times clockwise as sort of a symbolic way of saying this is for every activist, every atheist, every Christian, every non-believer, every homosexual. This is for all of the innocent who died at this very spot. And so that wheel is still going in my head. There's going to be a change from this Wahhabism. There's going to be a change from fundamentalist Islam, which is changing, but it won't be by pretending the scriptures that they follow are something that they're not. It won't be by taqiyya. It won't be by bending the rules and finding loopholes to make this system as it stands work out. It's not a matter of religions getting young or old. We see exactly what people stand for, or exactly what the faith stands for in the holy writings of any faith. People say, oh, the interpretation of the Bible changes over the time. It doesn't really. Neither does the interpretation of Buddhism. And these things are very, very much the same as they always have been. I'm just so distressed by news out of Saudi Arabia this week. And I'm going to talk about it a lot more because I have so much to say about the Saudis and what's happening in the Middle East right now. Until next time, over and out.